Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and once again it's time for a breakfast with Blaha. Yes, I'm eating Greek yogurt. See a pattern there? I eat a lot of Greek yogurt these days now. All right, over to the point. Let's talk a little bit about range of motion and hypertrophy. And I want to make this as simple as possible. I don't want to get into a lot of terms like active insufficiency and things like that that are going to confuse listeners because there are cases where some exercises, additional range of motion doesn't give you any benefits at all because we reach things like active insufficiency. But when it comes over to range of motion, generally speaking, and again, I want to make this clear, I don't want to make hard, fast rules. These are guidelines. Generally speaking, when range of motion is increased on an exercise, hypertrophy potential is higher. Now, get people to say, but I know tons of really jacked bodybuilders who don't do any full range of motion. They do nothing but partials. Right? Exactly. This is why we come over to that point of, generally speaking, potential is higher. Well, a lot of those guys are very genetically gifted. They're on a lot of stuff, usually tons and tons of stuff. They can get away with that. And when we're talking about potential here, it doesn't mean that you're automatically going to get bigger or that it's going to be a big difference. So, for example, let's say on the bench press, you are limited in your range of motion by the barbell touching your chest. Well, until you change barbells. I mean, for example, I have a couple of different barbells that can increase range of motion on the bench press. I have 2 different bars that can do that. Okay? Are they automatically going to make your pecs bigger? Maybe. Using that same logic though, shouldn't the closed grip bench press automatically make your pecs bigger? You're moving everything through a much longer range of motion, right? In some cases, depending upon your arm length and how wide you're going from a wide to a closed grip, it could be 4, 5, 6 inches difference on the range of motion. But is anyone out there saying, oh, well, the pecs grow way more from the closed grip? I've seen a couple of people suggest they might. I'm not sure that's the case. Upper chest, maybe. Certainly doesn't seem to be lower chest. But it's because the pecs themselves are not going through a longer range of motion. The bar is, right? But the joint angles on the pecs, it's not really significantly longer. Triceps are going through a lot more. So again, that's what makes it a good tricep exercise. It is putting more range of motion through the triceps. Right? You look at the elbow angles. Look at the elbow angles involved. The triceps and the elbow bend gets deeper. It's quite a bit deeper on a closed grip. So the triceps might be going through a longer range of motion, but again, it's a good tricep exercise. So let's look at something like dumbbells. So this is the reason we use dumbbells. You get a lot of people who say stuff like, no, the dumbbell because it lets you balance both sides. No, it doesn't. Look, if you're doing rep work with 225 on a barbell, right, even if a medium grip here, almost all the weight's on the outside. Okay, that whole barbell is only 45 pounds. How much of that's in the middle? Very little. Very, very little. It's all out on the ends. It's on the ends. That's just for the 45 pounds. There's only like 5 pounds in the middle between your hands. The other 40 pounds is outside the hands. Then you're putting those other plates on there. Okay, so if you got 225 on the bar doing rep work, there's 110 pounds on each side outside of your hands. It's balanced. And if it gets unbalanced, you'll see it. It is blaringly obvious. And if you're filming yourself, you know that you're all catawampus. Right? You can see it yourself. Oh yeah, I'm really using one side more than the other. It becomes blaringly obvious. It's not why we use dumbbells. We use dumbbells because we can get a deeper range of motion. Because we are not limited, right? We're not limited by the bar touching the chest. We can get deeper, get an inch or 2 deeper. That's why. That's what makes it a good chest exercise. It gets a little more stretch on the chest at the bottom. Therefore, in theory, it may have more hypertrophic potential, but it's not that much range of motion. When we see these studies that look at range of motion and hypertrophy, they're usually comparing half reps. They're not trying to compare a rep that's 24 inches versus 25 inches. That's not what they're comparing. They're usually doing half reps, right? They're usually doing half reps. And we find that in most muscles, what do we find? Doing full range of motion versus half reps usually equals more hypertrophy. In some cases, it's a lot more. In some cases, it's a lot more, like up to 4 times as much. But that's not comparing adding 1 inch or 2 inches. So keep in mind, it's just giving you a little more potential. We can get a lot more tension on the barbell, though, than we can on the dumbbells. Right? So in practice, when we start looking at hypertrophy studies, there's not necessarily a significant difference. But how about if we use both? Okay, this is where things like dumbbells shine on chest presses. Can't you do a barbell and a dumbbell exercise if you wanted? Right, you can do the heavier work with the barbell, then you can get that slightly deeper stretch with dumbbells as a second lift. Now that has a lot of potential because we're working 2 different angles. We're working 2 slightly different angles with different ranges of motion. That works really well, but there's no guarantee that dumbbells are going to build more than a barbell. They might, due to the range of motion, but it is at the expense of considerable load in this case. A lot of times it's quite a bit difference in the total mechanical tension being used, and that matters because the mechanical tension still matters. And then we get into the difference. Really, your differences in range of motion, your big differences tend to be that it's more strength related. In other words, if you do an exercise that is a partial versus a full range of motion, when we go look at the strength carryover, usually the strength carryover is better than what's more specific. In other words, if you were to practice doing nothing but 2 board presses, right, versus, say, dumbbell presses, and then you test your maxes on each one, even if you got a little more hypertrophy from the dumbbell presses and the pecs, your 2 board press max is still going to be higher if you've been working on the 2 board. Why? Because of joint angle specificity, right? Hypertrophy equals strength potential, but you're hypertrophying more of the fibers that are specific to the joint angles you're working. Well, that tends to give better carryover. Okay, it tends to give better carryover. So really it depends on what we're trying to achieve here, right? The only time we see the get much better is sometimes we compare like half squats to full squats. Sometimes the full range of motion squats improve the max more even on the half squat because there's way more quad hypertrophy. It's significantly more. And we also have to factor in a range of motion. What about when multiple joints are involved? For example, say a curl. We could curl all the way down. We could come up. And that would be the full range of motion of the elbow, right? Flexion of the elbow. Well, that's the primary purpose of the bicep. Realistically, you could develop most of your bicep by doing that. But the argument would be, what about this? Right? And we don't have to do it as 2 separate ones. I'm showing you for example, because you could come up. Why does that matter? Because one of the heads of the bicep is involved in shoulder extension, and that is part of the function of the bicep. You get a lot of people who will say stuff like, oh, but the twisting of the wrist, that doesn't have any hypertrophic stimulus. It's not significant tension involved there. But that second movement with the shoulder is. That is one of the functions of the bicep, but only one of the heads is involved. However, if you did that, is it possible that head might get more stimulation? Not the whole bicep, but just part of it. Yeah, absolutely. Same thing with triceps, right? You just do a press down. Elbows, right? Just doing extension of the elbow. Well, that's the primary job of the lateral and medial heads, not the long head up here. Well, it gets more involved when there's shoulder extension involved. So if we're doing something that's behind the head, or we have one where we have any shoulder extension involved, like even if you're doing press downs, if you're coming up, right? What are we getting? That extra range of motion involves one of the heads more. but it's not range of motion of the joint. And we could argue that even range of motion of the exercise, because you're just doing a press down or an extension like a skull crusher to your face versus a laying extension that goes behind your head. What's happening here? Well, we're involving another joint. Have we increased the range of motion of the joint, the main joint? No. We've increased the range of motion of the exercise because we've turned it into a multi-joint movement. So in both of those cases, everyone likes to use the term isolation versus compound. That's bodybuilding terms. The real terms are multi-joint versus single joint. That's what's used in sports science. Well, in both cases, we've turned those really simple exercises into a multi-joint movement, haven't we? We've made it a bigger exercise. Technically, if we wanted to use the bodybuilder type term, we've turned them into a compound movement. Do they have more hypertrophy potential? Well, we know the ones with the long head do on the tricep. We could argue on the bicep. So you see where we're going with this? Range of motion, again, it can sometimes be an arbitrary thing. Are we doing the full range of motion of the joint? Are we doing a range of motion that involves a second joint to let us move it further? Are we doing the full range of motion of the muscle? Again, it gets a little more nuanced. And again, if we're adding extra range of motion on an exercise, are we adding more range of motion for the primary muscle we're trying to work? Not necessarily. Again, come back over to the example of the bench press. That closer grip bench versus the wider grip. We've added more range of motion, but we haven't added range of motion for the pecs when we go to a close grip, have we? Not really. We've added more range of motion for the tricep, which is usually we're benching with triceps as a secondary concern. So again, it can be a little more nuanced than that, but the thing to remember is that generally speaking, and there are exceptions, there are studies that find exceptions, particularly things like triceps, but generally speaking, if we can increase the range of motion of the muscle, we're going to have slightly more hypertrophic potential. And if the word is potential, it's not guaranteed, right? You're not automatically going to gain more muscle, just that you might be able to. And if you're trying to bleed out, squeeze out every last drop of muscle mass, it could be worth your while to pursue that, at least on some of your exercises. All right, guys, well, that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.